Chapter 6. Home at Mount Vernon. Washington returned to Mount Vernon. It was wonderful to be reunited with old friends after years of fighting in the wilderness. But Washington was restless. His life was not yet complete. "I am almost 27 years old already," he told his friends. "I'm ready to find a wife, settle down, and raise a family." He contacted his agent in London to order new furniture for Mount Vernon. He also took other steps to beautify the mansion and the surrounding land. George met Martha Dandridge Custis at a dance attended by the cream of Virginia society. Recently widowed, the 27-year-old Mrs. Custis was one of the wealthiest young women in the colony. She had two small children, Jackie and Patsy. They lived in a huge mansion called the White House, which had 6 chimneys. Washington was attracted to Martha almost immediately. She was just the type of woman he and Mount Vernon needed. "You're all invited to a wedding," George announced to his friends. "It will be here at Mount Vernon on January 6, 1759. Shortly before George and Martha were married, however, George was called upon to wage one more military campaign in the wilderness west of Virginia. He corresponded briefly with Martha while he was away, telling her, "We have begun our march for the Ohio. A courier is starting for Williamsburg, and I embrace the opportunity to send a few words to one whose life is now inseparable from mine. Since that happy hour when we made our pledges to each other, my thoughts have been continually going to you." At last, George returned from his military duties, and the couple's wedding day was finally at hand. George and Martha made a handsome couple at their wedding. George, towering above his bride, wore his full-dress military uniform. Martha's wedding dress was made of white satin with silver threads. She kept the dress for the rest of her life, along with the white military gloves that her new husband wore when he took her hand in marriage. Here's an illustration of their wedding. Guests came from near and far to celebrate with the new couple. George and Martha were very different. He was tall and slim and serious. She was short, plump, and always full of laughter. But they seemed happy together. Martha's children welcomed George as their new father, and he treated them as if they were his own. The relationship between George and Martha was one of friendship and affection. George needed a wife to help tend Mount Vernon and serve as a hostess at important social functions. Martha needed a husband to help manage her estate and be a father to her young children. Some of their friends regarded the union between George and Martha as mainly a business and a social arrangement that offered both of them many benefits. But in fact, they cared deeply about each other. For the next 16 years, from 1759 to 1775, George Washington lived a very contented and pleasure-filled life at Mount Vernon. During the days, he rode on horseback. Here's a picture or an illustration of that. During the days, he rode on horseback around his family's properties, checking on the condition of the buildings, the crops, and the slaves. In the evenings, he and Martha entertained guests. They stayed up late exchanging stories and jokes with their visitors. There were also many parties for the children. George Washington welcomed both the joys and responsibilities that came with being a parent. Martha's children called him Papa and treated him with great affection. He loved to buy them gifts, which he usually ordered all the way from London. His first order included 10 shillings worth of toys, 6 little books for children beginning to read, one fashionably dressed baby doll, and a box of gingerbread toys and sugar images. Washington also displayed a fatherly concern for the children's welfare. For example, he strongly supported a suggestion by Jack's tutor to vaccinate the boy against smallpox. Having suffered this terrible disease, Washington wanted Jack to escape its misery. But when the vaccine was first developed to protect people against it, people were concerned about its safety. Knowing how much Martha worried about her children, Washington instructed the tutor to arrange for Jack's vaccination along with the other students at the school. Only when Jack was safely vaccinated did George tell Martha. In addition to his warm relationship with Martha and his stepchildren, George Washington kept in close touch with his siblings and their families. He never stopped missing Lawrence. He was also very fond of his other half-brother, Austin, to whom he wrote, "The pleasure of your company at Mount Vernon always did and always will give me great satisfaction," and signed the note, "Your most affectionate brother." Actually, Washington's favorite brother was Jack. He once described the second of his 3 younger brothers as the close companion of my youth and the friend of my mature age. In his will, Washington left Mount Vernon to Jack's son, Bushrod. The relationship between Washington and his other 2 The relationship between Washington and his other 2 brothers, Samuel and Charles. Take 3, guys, I can't talk. The relationship between Washington and his other 2 brothers, Samuel and Charles, was rather cool. Nevertheless, he lent them both money on many occasions when they needed it. Samuel was constantly in debt, and Charles was undependable for most of his life. George maintained friendly relations with the members of his extended family too. They visited Mount Vernon frequently without waiting for formal invitations and found warm welcomes. On a typical day, Washington reported in his diary, "I returned home a little after noon and found my brother Austin, his wife, daughter Millie, and sons Bushrod and Corbin, along with the wife of the first, and my cousin William Washington with his wife and 4 children." Almost notable was Washington's warm feeling for his mother-in-law, Mrs. Dandridge. His relationship with his own mother, by contrast, continued to be rocky. He was always a good son, visiting her at Fredericksburg whenever she summoned him, supervising the operation of her plantation, and giving her money whenever she requested it. Mary Washington remained resentful, however. She wanted more than the performance of duty by her eldest son. She wished to dominate him as she dominated her 4 other children. She complained about him endlessly. George Washington's generosity toward his relatives and friends was quite extraordinary, even when one considers the large amount of wealth that he had accumulated. He lent money without pressuring for repayment, and he often provided money outright as a gift. To avoid embarrassing many recipients, he transferred money secretly. In one typical action, Washington wrote to William Ramsay, for whom he had worked as a surveyor in Alexandria, and asked for permission to send Ramsay's son to college. The boy was very bright and liked to study. Washington provided the money to enable him to attend Jersey College, now known as Princeton University. "No other return is expected or wished for this offer," Washington wrote to William Ramsay, "than that you will accept it with the same freedom and goodwill with which it is made, and that you may not even consider it in light of an obligation or mention it as such. For be assured that from me it will never be known." Two recipients of Washington's generosity wanted the money to advance their careers in the Royal Army. When Billy Fairfax, the younger brother of George William, bought a commission in the Royal Army, Washington sent him money and wrote that he didn't care if it took 7 years to repay. Shortly after, Billy died fighting alongside the English troops on the Plains of Abraham in the battle that captured Canada from the French. On still another occasion, Washington fulfilled a request from an artist who had once taught drawing to the staff at Mount Vernon. The man wrote, "I prefer to owe you that favor than to anybody else, being certain of secrecy." In his later years, Washington took upon himself the burden of educating and otherwise supporting 22 nieces and nephews. At one point, he estimated that he had spent a total of more than $5,000 on 2 nephews alone, the sons of his brother Samuel. Every Christmas, Washington gave from $250 to $500 to charities as well. Washington was as quick to show anger as to display generosity. He particularly disliked people who were dishonest and those who wrongfully demanded favors. Once he wrote a very nasty letter to a former officer in the militia who had been thrown out of the army for cowardly behavior in the French and Indian War, and who had later dared to demand a share of the lands that the royal government had given to veterans of that battle. The man had written to Washington accusing him of cheating him out of the land. "Sir," replied Washington, "your rude letter arrived yesterday. I am not accustomed to receiving such vulgar mail. Even if you were drunk when you wrote it, that is no excuse. In your stupidity, you forgot to look in the Public Gazette, which would have informed you that you received what you were entitled to. Even if you think you deserved more, did you really believe that I would go out of my way to accommodate you? My only regret is that I ever concerned myself with such a rude and ungrateful fellow as yourself." On another occasion, Washington was riding around his plantation when he heard gunfire from the riverbank. Rushing toward the sound, he saw 2 dead ducks on the shore and a man crouching in a canoe that was partly hidden by tall reeds. He recognized the poacher at once, a man who had often sneaked onto Washington's property in search of waterfowl and other creatures. "Stop, or I will shoot," shouted the poacher as Washington approached rapidly. He raised himself up in his canoe and aimed his gun. "It is you who must stop," replied Washington, ignoring the threat and the weapon. "How many times have I told you to stay off my property?" His face livid with rage, Washington drove his horse into the water, leaned down to the canoe, and dragged the vessel and the passenger to dry land. Washington then dismounted and threw himself at the poacher, forcing him to the ground on his knees. Here's an illustration showing him going after the poacher. "This is the last time that you will trespass on my property and go home alive," Washington thundered, knocking the poacher's gun to the ground and leaving him there. That was George Washington's reaction to dishonesty, as well as his sense of care and responsibility for his property. That's the end of Chapter 6, guys. Chapter 7 is called A Peaceful Life, and we'll read that in a day or so. So Chapter 7 is next, and we only have chapters, let me see, I believe it's going to be 11 chapters. So 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 5 chapters left. I'll see you guys tomorrow.